Hi, you're listening to the She Speaks, We Hear podcast. This is a platform for British Muslim women to talk about the issues that matter to them. Muslim women have been identified as a hard-to-reach section of society. Our aim on this podcast is to get our voices heard. Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of the She Speaks, We Hear podcast. Today we're speaking to Dana Abdulkarim, who became the first hijab-wearing Muslim woman to represent England in any sport. She has a career spanning 13 years and 67 caps. She's also the first hijabi woman to qualify to teach PE. She's a trustee for Chance to Shine, a charity which uses the power of cricket to engage 500,000 young people annually. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the podcast.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you ever so much for inviting me on.
Thanks for coming on. How have you been? How's your week going?
Well, it's term time, so it's pretty frenetic, but alhamdulillah, finding time for me, finding time for friends, and lots of reflection because of what's happening in the current sphere within sport.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to come on to that in a bit, but just to give those listening a little bit of background to yourself, as well as what I just said. 67 caps. That is something. That is some record, mashallah. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm the second of 5 children to a Palestinian father. My dad was born in Gaza, and an English Yorkshire / Essex mother. So I have Uncle Victor's on one side of the family and I have Uncle Fuad's on the other side. I'm from Rotherham. That's where most of my life was spent. And we were the only Muslims in our village. And as a group of 5 children, I'm very blessed that my parents ensured that we always had people to play with. We were always encouraged to spend lots of time with our siblings, and having a really strong Islamic upbringing in a non-diverse community was a really important part of my formative years. The 5 children, we've all gone on to do lots of different things. So I work in education. I have siblings that are involved in medicine, in IT, very typical kind of Muslim endeavors. But for me, sport was always my passion. In the schools within my younger years, you either watched people play sport or you got involved. And I've never been one to sit on the sidelines, and I just loved playing. And game sports I had a natural affinity towards. So it all started really in primary school, playing lots of games, joining in, learning how to play football, which at that time it had to be on the boys' team because there were not girls' teams around, playing cricket, rounders, just getting completely stuck into it. As a primary passion, it became then, I guess, my secondary school identity. I went to Sheffield Girls High School and had 7 years, my GCSEs and A-levels there, and really was surrounded by an environment that was empowering for women, as opposed to learning that we perhaps need to stay small, which, I think women still struggle with. That learning environment and the Girls' Day School Trust really propelled women to think, well, why not me? I'm going to work hard and then put myself in positions to fulfill my own dreams and ambitions. And it was whilst I was 13 years old that I first broke into the England team with rounders, and subsequently represented them all the way through all the junior teams, right up to the adult England side. Had the honour of representing my country as captain on 5 occasions. And then whilst at university, was approached about coaching an England side as well. So from 19 until 26, I coached my own junior England team. And happily, we never lost a fixture. They were coached very well.
Wow, that's an achievement in itself.
It was something I was very proud of. So I was very, very proud of. But it also reminded me of my overall goal. Sport and playing for my country was an ambition, but being able to teach sport has always felt incredibly natural to me. I love being able to ignite an interest in somebody else. And I'm very much of the belief that everybody can access sport and it shouldn't be exclusive. And I work really hard to try and do that as an educator. I then went to university in Liverpool to train as a PE teacher, and very consciously wanted to go somewhere that had the pedigree and the fame for being an excellent development centre for teaching of PE. And was very lucky to qualify and teach in 2008, bringing me back to Yorkshire to teach. I chose to work in a school that was monoethnic, so not diverse actually, all Caucasian. I think it was 99.3% Caucasian, white British. And I saw that as an opportunity for myself to use my essentially my USP, my unique element of being a Muslim, very visibly Muslim teacher of PE, to educate young people about a lived experience, the reality of an experience of being a Muslim in this country, having been a student when 9/11 happened. So I very much tried to use my role within the community that I work in to allow for a more fair representation, and therefore that questioning, curiosity and knowledge has been able to be a key feature of my work as a teacher. Obviously, you've intimated the different roles I've had, and I've been really, really fortunate, alhamdulillah, to go into leadership, to lead teams, to change education. Within my role of educating children, I've also taken them around the world. So we've been on sports tours, using sport as a vehicle, to South Africa, to West Coast America, to East and West Coast Canada. And we've raised over £130,000 to enable families from disadvantaged backgrounds to be able to do so. And now latterly, I am a trustee of a sports board. So Chance to Shine, I've been involved with them for about 20 months now. And I give them a school's perspective. And this charity does amazing things for young people across the length and breadth of the UK. And they represent all communities. But they were looking for somebody with my experience within education to allow them to maybe tap into more schools, more primary schools, more secondary schools, so that they can continue to be relevant, especially so post-pandemic.
What's fascinating to me about yourself is that, like, really, we don't see many Muslim women. We play on grassroots levels, but to get that national status and play for your country, that is really rare, I think. And I think that's why I really was quite keen to get you on, because generally people think of Muslim women, they lead a sheltered life. This is a misconception that many people have. So were you encouraged to do sport?
Well, at first, I think it was just seen as just something that I did. It was safe, it was positive. And actually, exercise is Islamic. To look after your health is Islamic. And my dad has made many brave decisions in his life, including coming to the UK to do his degree and then staying here. And so he's always used his knowledge of his faith to inform his decisions. And so playing as a youngster, not an issue. Obviously, when I became a hijabi, which was 15, 16, that I thought actually would have been the end of my sports playing, definitely at kind of competition levels. And it meant that I resisted the hijab for a while, or tried to delay it for as long as possible. And it was actually my dad that turned around and said, Dana, go and get educated. You can't not play sport because of the scarf. Go and find out what it actually says before you have this ignorant view that that's the end. And to his credit, he's absolutely right. Of course you can play sport wearing a hijab. It doesn't say anything about that. And so I had to find an alternative, because sadly the sports hijabs that now exist were not in existence in the late 90s, early noughties. And so I found a solution. And so in that manner, my family absolutely supported me in trying to instill a good work ethic. My father also ensured that, if I'm going to be doing all of this sport and often out until quite late at night, because I was playing 5 or 6 sports to quite a high level, I needed to match it up with the work in the classroom. So I was always reminded of my responsibility to myself to make sure that I was taking care and learning the skills of independence and time management. And, my family absolutely supported. Some sports, it was a little bit more difficult. Football was one of them that my father was more reticent as I grew older for me to be involved in, simply because of the rules at the time where the hijab was banned, but also the physicality and the nature of it. And for me, my religion has never been it's not a handicap. It's not something that should put me in a deficit. So I understand and respect women who choose to play their sport in grassroots or segregated or female only. But my objective in sport was to really see, well, could I go high? Can I go and do something that somebody hasn't done before? For myself, it wasn't a case of recognizing nobody's done this before with a hijab on. It was a case of, no, if I'm good enough, then I want to be good enough, regardless of my faith or my heritage or my attire. And I then wanted to put myself in those environments where I did stand out. I am a minority still. And I didn't have other role models or coaches that had experience of being with non-diverse performers, with diverse performers, to be able to kind of nurture me. So it was a case of me going, right, this is what I want to do. I'm safe. My family supported it in allowing me that space to do so. I was never made to feel that I had to compromise my identity. And I think now they're incredibly proud of it. Although, as typical with Arab families, my dad won't tell me that he's proud of it. He'll tell the community, and I find out by proxy. But that's how it seems to work.
So you could say you're a bit of a trailblazer in that respect, because you said, so we're talking about the noughties when, there weren't sports hijabs, like you said. You were the first woman who wore hijab and represented England. But I guess for youngsters nowadays, it's not as difficult. Would you agree?
I do agree. And I think through myself, through sport in general, becoming more diverse, and sports leadership and organisation admitting that they had a diversity problem. They probably still have a diversity problem where they hadn't considered other perspectives. Sport is trying to, and it has to, open up. The rules used to be very different in certain sports because they were written 50, 60, 100 years ago. For example, netball rules, you used to have to wear a dress or a netball skirt. And that's all well and good. But if you're a hijabi and the skirt finishes mid-thigh, in order for you to play that game, I had to wear the skirt and then I had to figure out what else. And so I played for South Yorkshire. So the county colours for South Yorkshire are purple, Cadbury purple, green and white. And I had to find some bright purple tracksuit bottoms, which are very difficult to come by.
Yes.
That I would then wear underneath my skirt. And then the netball top was a vest-like kind of a tunic top. So then there was a top underneath that, and then my scarf. And the scarf I was allowed to play netball in, there was only one type of scarf, one material of scarf that the governing body had given me permission. We had to have a written letter all the time to prove I was allowed to wear this, because there were referees and umpires that would tell me to get off of the court. And
wow.
Because the rules were really clear. But the rules were themselves the problem. It wasn't what I was wearing. If anything, I had to be fitter than everybody else. I had to be more uncomfortable than everybody else in order to have parity. And I know and recognize that a number of Muslim women, perhaps in the same situation, would have gone, right, well, that's clearly too many barriers. I will step aside. But I never wanted my religion to be a reason why I didn't have an opportunity. So I fought through it. But that's netball. But other sports have had these kind of issues. But now I think maybe because more people are speaking up, more people have tried to participate, these unconscious things that have been put in place, because I don't think netball did it on purpose. That was just the rule when it was written.
It's just the traditional attire that you wore from the beginning that nobody questioned.
Absolutely. And it doesn't make a difference to how well you can play the game. It really doesn't. But until it's been challenged, and then there's been some active reflection to go, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, that would disable or cause a barrier. Perhaps we can adapt and be more open. And the netball rules have changed. And the I think the Mavericks that are based in Sale, for a recent netball tournament, which it's a team that, to my knowledge, I don't think it has a Muslim player in the team. It's got a very cosmopolitan team, but they were wearing sports leggings. So the sport is moving on and things are adapting. And I think that's part of the problem. When I was playing, I was that person finding these potholes. And so often I would be there then figuring out a fix for myself, but highlighting it. At my university, there were things within my degree that I could have quite easily said were discriminating against me, but they were not consciously put in place. These are institutional ways that things have been done for a very long time. And until somebody with an element of otherness or minority faces it head on, how can an organization without diversity recognize that there's a problem? And they can't. And for me as a teacher, I see that as an opportunity in order to make it better for the next person. So I'm not angry about my experience. I feel sad sometimes that it took me right at the end of the 20th century to highlight some of these things, because I'd have hoped that somebody would have had that opportunity sooner. But I wonder if sport would have been paying attention sooner it seems to be now is the time that there's more change, there's more adaptation, there's more openness to inclusivity. I don't think it was a term that people fully respected 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, to your credit, because you were a young person at the time, and not everybody is that determined or headstrong, you could call it, or just willing to speak up. They may be really good at the sport and really passionate about the sport, but it takes a different kind of mentality to ask for things and be, assertive like that. So it's really great that you've done that and opened the doors for hopefully so many other young women. And I guess that kind of can segue quite nicely into the other thing that we wanted to talk about, and that is racism in sport, especially since what's been happening with Yorkshire County Cricket Club. For anybody who doesn't know, we're referring to allegations of racism made by Azim Rafiq. He gave his testimony about a week ago at time of recording this podcast, and it was quite shocking for many people, many Muslims, many Asians, not just Pakistanis, but Asians generally. A lot of them could identify with some of the experiences that Azim Rafiq actually spoke about. So Dana, you're from Yorkshire. You're heavily involved in cricket and sport, as we've discovered. What did you make of everything that came to light?
Well, I think like anybody from a minority, and I'm not exclusively talking about race and religion, although obviously that is my most obvious minority label, if you want to call it that. Everything that Azim spoke about, I didn't just recognize it, I felt it. I was reminded of my own experiences. They could have been coming out of my own mouth from my sports access, not just at international level, but right down to playing in the schoolyard. This was not a surprise, and this is not a recent phenomena. Unfortunately, for those of us from minorities that do make it into what is still a largely dominated in whiteness sphere of society, sport still, despite having the banner of being for all, because of the many barriers, tends to be for a specific gender, a specific colour, a specific faith in this country. Well, racism has been as frequent in my sporting experience as the many amazing and great things that I thank sport for. I have been actively involved in sport for 25 years. I have 25 years worth of experience that I could talk about. My earliest memory of racism in general is from 4 years old, and I'm 35.
Wow, 4 years old.
4 years old. In the centre of the town that we lived in, my mum, she was a revert, she became a Muslim in her late 20s. And, her maiden name was Woolley, very, very English heritage background. But she chose to be a hijabi. And there was myself, my two younger siblings and an elder sibling. She had, bless her, 4 children under the age of 6 at one point. And we were walking through the centre of town and we were given the P word slur. Now I know it's a podcast, but I'm white. I'm very, very white. And as a 4-year-old, didn't recognize that in the first instance as linked to color, just thought it was something linked to being a Muslim. And I actually think that racial slur it's just synonymously used. It's transitional. It's not just thrown at South Asians or people that are a light brown or black. It's thrown out as anybody by proxy. So called the P word, had stones thrown at us and being told to go back to our own country. I was born in this country. And I can remember at the time, my mother with 4 very young children, just encouraging us to hold onto the pushchair and to walk with her and to not engage. But there are numerous occasions throughout my childhood where that was quite frequent. That experience was frequent. And my mother would often be given additional comments when people would realize that she'd chosen this faith. She would be given a second helping, as it were, of racism. And I became quite, defensive of her and would try and stick up for her, and was taught very clearly by my parents. They had a very clear line, and I think this probably aligns with many people from ethnic minorities. Do not reinforce the hatred by trying to reflect it back. My father's advice has always been protect yourself and then get away from it. So the idea of challenging racism when younger, and I imagine this could have been similar for people within sport, that is seen as then the more conflict side of the racism argument. So we instead are trained to absorb it. And I think Azim's testimony last week was his 20 years of absorbing it. And rather than challenging it at the time or speaking out or having other people that have witnessed it be in support of challenging those ignorant views, it's been more comfortable for us to turn a blind eye. So this has become the cultural norm that I expected, it sounds awful to say it, but I expected to face racism in my sport, and I did.
You were prepared for it. Well, I was prepared. Not really prepared mentally, but you knew it might happen.
Yeah, and I expected to encounter racism as a PE teacher in a white-dominated school, in a white-dominated village. I expected it. And it's wrong to expect it. And it's wrong to then just take it, because I wonder if, because that's been maybe the learned culture for people on the receiving end as minorities, have we given it longevity? Have we allowed it to seep into almost our behavior, that we can explain away unkind comments as banter, that we can remove the severity by calling it a microaggression? There's nothing micro about racism. Every single example of racism I've experienced has had a traumatic trace, has a trigger. And listening to Azim last week, that's exactly what I felt. And I needed to watch it privately. I didn't watch it live. I was teaching. I watched it privately, knowing full well that I was going to see myself in that press conference, that I was going to hear my own stories and be reminded of some very well padded down pain. Because in order for me to do the thing that I was passionate about, that had to be also part of my experience. And I'm not saying it's right, but that's the reality of the situation. I knew that was coming. I knew I would have problems. I knew that some opponents would make it particularly volatile and difficult for me. That has been my experience in sport, sadly.
And I think a lot of people are like that. They know that something different, they'll have a different experience, and that puts people off from progressing. Like we were talking about before, that you have to have certain determination, willpower to pursue what you love. But one of the things you said, which is really interesting, is that we're sort of trained to absorb these sort of comments. And I think you meant as sportsmen, but also as minorities as well. We're trained to absorb these things. Absolutely. For example, I think when a lot of immigrants came to this country in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they did want to just, keep the head down and keep working. And those are the kind of not values, but kind of thinking that they instilled in their children, not consciously, maybe subconsciously or accidentally to yourself, unnecessarily. Speak out for what's wrong, but not if you can basically just bear it, grin and bear it, get on with it, get your education, get a good job. That's basically the primary objective of everything.
I agree. I think it's been about protection and maintenance, and there is risk when you are an outlier. And I'm very conscious that whether I like it or not, the majority of my life has been as an outlier. The role and the career that I have, the subject I teach, the level that I've performed at, I don't quite fit the mold. But for that very reason, I think that has then been a strength to my strategy to deal with it, because I do not look like a stereotypical Muslim in Britain. I'm an Arab Muslim. I don't have an accent, which if you speak to my dad, he has a thick Palestinian accent when he speaks English. So immediately, just by my sheer presence, some norms I challenge. And then the fact that I have the East and West, which I think increasingly more and more British Muslims have got more than just their heritage side of their families, and they are not just living their heritage side within their homes. I am proudly both, and I am both all of the time. But I am completely understanding about how we can naturally have ignorant views passed on to us. An anecdote being, one of my university housemates, one of my best friends at university, she was a non-Muslim. We did a fitness class, as the whole house did. And at the end of it, she remarked that she was sweating like an Arab. And my immediate response was to just look at her and go, are you being serious? Not because she wasn't aware of what she'd said. She wasn't aware of how that colloquialism would have felt, how it had a serious undertone. And it allowed for an opportunity for me to go, right, I wasn't aware of that piece of ignorance, but I'm going to educate you about why that is not what you should say, and how it felt to me as an Arab for you to have said that. And I think that's a really important part in trying to move forward from this, because you're right, we've been taught not to think small, we've been taught to protect ourselves. I was 15, 16 when 9/11 happened. I have felt the full force through physical assault, sadly, of how the approach towards Muslims changed. And I've been very aware of, not trying to bring unwanted, unsafe attention to myself, but wherever there has been an opportunity to educate, to allow a person who maybe has an unconscious bias or a learned bias or a racist view, I've taken it in the hope that then at the next opportunity, they will not repeat the same mistake. Because I hold my hands up. I am sure there are times where inadvertently I have phrased something the wrong way, or I may have had very little exposure to another minority person's experiences, and could fall into these traps because we've been careless in the past, I think, with the way that we've talked about society. And also, as society has learnt more about what is and is not appropriate language, we're in a cycle of reviewing and reflecting. Where this falls down is in the let's just keep denying it. Well, we can't deny it. The evidence is abundant. It is a cacophony of proof right now. And I think Yorkshire Cricket have issued a new hotline over the last 24 hours. And in the first 24 hours, they've had over 36 calls of other examples of players that have been accessing provisions within the cricket, within the region, that they feel could also be racist and ignorant. So this is not a quiet moment. And this is not something that should just go quietly, or we should be outraged for a little bit, talk about it, and then it normalizes again, where people can deny the validity of racism. The police's definition of racism is if it felt like racism to the person it was directed at, then it is racism. So we need to stop questioning how truthful somebody feels about what's been experienced. We need to admit it. We need to analyze it, pull it apart, be really open in our own ignorances, with a genuine commitment to trying to move forward. And for me, education is where that can happen.
What do you think the ECB or other cricket, the cricket counties, because there's been some reports from Essex and other counties across the country, what do you think they can do going forward now?
I don't think this is just cricket's problem. I think cricket as a sport is feeling the focus right now. But you look back to the summer of this year, and football was very much under a cloud of racism after 3 players missed a penalty. I think sport in general needs to not just deal with the racism, but it's the wider problem. Some of these experiences of making people feel like outsiders are because of the cultures that are within those sport systems. So how they are behaving recreationally, whether or not alcohol is a really big part of the experience. And I found as a rounders player, when I was an England player in a junior side, alcohol wasn't a factor. Children can't drink. So we didn't, over tours and weekends, it didn't need to be something else that added otherness into the mix. When I was a teenager playing in the adult side, alcohol was a huge part of the culture. And so I had to manage it the only way that I could, which would be of an evening to take myself to my room, because I'm incredibly uncomfortable around alcohol and the impacts of it. But because there was a lack of education to the other players. Some players interpreted that as me separating myself, not wanting to be part of the team. So there is this wider education about diversity for anybody that's accessing a sport. And that shouldn't be the responsibility of the one minority or the few minority people. That's the organization trying to open up the sport for everybody involved. I think sport also needs to look at, how do you develop this idea of an upstander so that it isn't always the person that has experienced racism that is needing to flag it. It's an incredibly difficult thing, and brings guilt and shame and uncertainty when you are at that precipice of, do I pass this on or do I just let it lie? And I think to just have it as the responsibility of the individual doesn't empower sport. It pressurizes, again, the minority person of sticking their head up above the parapet and taking the risk of not being believed. But if sport can find a way to educate all of its service users so that they can understand any behavior that discriminates and then what to do about it, because that's the issue, the whistleblowing, the support and endorsement, the recognizing of inappropriate behavior. Can we catch ourselves in a mistake, deal with it, get educated and move forward? Sport has got the focus of the press looking at it square in the eyes, and certainly cricket. This is a wider problem. This is a much wider problem. It's a systemic, institutionally learned behavior that I think we've inherited through years and years of inaction, because of the perception that what's happened was a small thing. Banter cannot be the excuse anymore. And I think the moment they go for a zero tolerance with clear codes of practice, with clear support and education, with clear opportunities to enable people to learn from their mistakes, because, I'm still very good friends with my housemate that said sweating like an Arab. They were completely unaware of how that phrase was the wrong thing to do. But they have had an opportunity to learn. I think forgiveness is a really important cycle in all of this. It's about recognizing we are imperfect people, but then having a commitment to ensuring that it isn't repeated. And sadly, this is all too repeatable. Azim Rafiq's testimony was too repeatable. And I'm sure you recognized elements of his story. I think everybody recognized it because it's too repeatable. If we can really have those systems, and if those systems are then reinforced through schools, playgrounds, all aspects of society, then we have a chance. We have a chance of trying to eradicate it. Sport does, though, I think, in this country, whether people are fans of sport or exercise, I think is a moot point. Sport is so important to the identity of being British. And again, you go back to the Euros, even if you're not a football fan, you got absorbed into the Euros this year. So if sport can fix itself and can model this, then everybody benefits. Every industry would benefit, because so many of us access the sports and leisure industry that then we'll go into our workplaces more informed, maybe more astute to the subtle racism that is in place, that we will have thought about other perspectives, because we all naturally live in these echo chambers of our own experiences. And it is very hard to think about, is what I've planned enabling everybody? But that's where sport, I think, could do that. It's got the funds, and certain sports like football, like cricket, that have got huge numbers and lots of money and have a lot of reach, they could do a lot of the figuring out, because they're always going to remain popular. They're always going to remain popular. And then if they can make it that the environment doesn't have those challenges, then the choice to access it becomes one more step towards being inclusive. And I think if you can then make sport not have racism as an expectation, then you can look at other things that create otherness, like socioeconomic status, gender, orientation. Those are all other factors that I think are affecting the true openness of sport, the true equality of sport. But racism is something that, if we don't deal with it, if we continue to acknowledge its existence, but then step away from the responsibility of improving it, then sport never gets better. There's never more representation. It's always a token thing. And I think sport really could be transformative in the progress for society as a whole, and not just as a sports person.
Okay, so that lot of things to unpack in what you just said. Firstly, yes, sport is something that brings everybody together, and that's the beauty of sport, right? So whether it's the Euros or whether it's the World T20 World Cup, sport brings people together from all different backgrounds, different races, ethnicities, because it's global, right? So that's why sport is so important, as you said. So in terms of racism, there's so many things that went through people's minds when they were listening to Azim Rafiq's testimony. And yeah, I got very emotional listening to it because, as you said, yes, I did resonate with some of the things he said. And I read on Twitter so many people, different people giving their accounts and how the testimony made them feel. And it was a really sad day for many of us. And what I also noticed was lots of Azim Rafiq's old colleagues, they were also sending him messages. And I also noticed that there were many who didn't. So do you think, firstly, there's been people who should have said something who haven't? If they say something, then it makes a difference, because when it all first came out, people were questioning it. A very popular program on the BBC had the question, is it banter? Can the P word ever be banter? It's fine for a discussion, but people actually questioning it when they have absolutely no experience of having any racism towards them, because they are white and they have white privilege, whether they recognize it or not. But for people to come out and question it was, made you feel even worse, because it's like, well, why do you, try and understand? So it is about getting the dialogue going. But are there any people you think could have spoken out? Could more celebs or sportsmen in the public eye done a bit more?
I think without a doubt, it would have been, we would have perhaps got to this point of reflection and action faster had those with a profile used it in endorsement of this. What we saw when this was first shared was a collective attempt to discredit it, a collective attempt to shift the focus, and lots of the press and media were reframing their headlines so that an uneducated eye could read it and almost assume that it was Azim Rafiq that was the aggressor and Yorkshire was the victim. Because in admitting that this is a problem with long-standing history, I think means an element of culpability and an admission that, yes, there was this problem and I did nothing and allowed it to do nothing for however many years. I think people took the easy route of silence, essentially being compliance. I've experienced that within my own racism, where people that I thought might be stronger, when the push came to shove, they chose to stay comfortable with their privilege and thinking that silence meant that they were not a part of it. But actually the noise of the silence from some prolific men and women within the game was deafening. That has been as loud as the lack of action initially by Yorkshire after their internal inquiry, because I think it begs the question of, well, why not? Does it conflict with your morals, or is it that you are under pressure from sponsors? Where is the risk? And some people perhaps choosing silence, it may be that they didn't understand or still do not understand why upstanders, why allies, why speaking in solidarity to add more weight and gravitas to a subject that was being discredited in order to try and prevent it from being looked at more closely. This happened in 2017, most of his experience, and he's tried for the last 9 months to get something to happen. It's just finally broken through because of a non-British media outlet gave him a platform. So he's persisted with it, where I think many others faced with that kind of silence, would have gone quiet. And it's his sheer tenacity and clearly the support network around him, and of those few people that were speaking up, that they were endorsing him to keep going with it, and eventually there would be the breakthrough. It's left a little bit of egg on the face of all of those that have chosen to be silent, because it does beg the question, well, where were you? Where exactly was the risk for you in speaking up? Because you didn't have to say, I've said X or Y, because if you haven't, you haven't. But in admitting, I saw something and I wasn't equipped or educated or felt strong enough at the time to challenge it, well, that's true of pretty much all of sport. So it wouldn't be you being the fault of the racism. It would just be another example of the kind of endemic problem. So that opportunity was missed. And I do wonder if, as this continues to be talked about and more voices come forward, that other athletes in other sports might choose to be more proactive sooner in admitting their own errors, because I don't think there's anything wrong in admitting that you were not aware of the implications of non-action, but fully recognize that that has added to a person's feelings and want the sport to be better.
Yeah, and you mentioned forgiveness, and that's something that Azim Rafiq has said. There's people who haven't apologized. And if people who played with him at the time, like you said, just acknowledge that they didn't realize or whatever, just come out and say it. This whole ego that, and I guess it's more prevalent in sports, especially in a male environment, this ego stops them from, and pride stops them from coming forward and apologizing for being unaware, even if they didn't say anything, just not speaking out or not just realizing. It's not that hard to do it. And it does make me wonder why people hold back. There was another thing you were talking about, alcohol. I think alcohol is such a big part of sport in this country. Football, cricket, and mainly those two sports. I mean, you go and you have beers, that's what people do. So separating the two is a tricky thing. Do you think, how much responsibility does alcohol have for a lot of experiences that people have actually spoken about? Because I know it literally adds fuel to the fire, but it's not the root cause, is it?
It's not the root cause, but for me, when I've experienced different kinds of racism in sport, and sometimes it's been through a lax lip and somebody's made a statement, but it's probably not directed at me, but it is a racist statement. Or I've had an opponent use racist language to try and gain an advantage. When I've had racism that I feel has been deliberately aimed in my direction, typically it's been fueled by alcohol. And the impact of alcohol, it immediately presents a barrier. And I know it's an incredibly difficult thing to separate. You know, I'm a Muslim woman that went and did a sports degree and played on sports university teams, and at one point was a university netball club captain, where there was a bar in the middle of the city that every Wednesday evening there would be, I think, a whole crate of alcoholic drinks in my name that I never received, and would just pass on my name to one of the netballers, because obviously I don't drink. It is a huge part of the culture. And what I can't say, and what I would love, and it's wrong, I would love for there to be no alcohol, but I'm also a realist, and it's a big part of some people's British identity. The issue for me is when alcohol is used as a fuel that then gives permission for more hatred, and for maybe adults to claim alcohol was the cause of their misdemeanor. Well, no, it wasn't. You may not have had as much control of your mouth, but the misdemeanor still came from you. You still had that belief or idea, and you acted it out. I think it becomes a really divisive part of sport when the only place that you can be with your teammates recreationally happens to be a pub or a gentleman's club type environment, because that doesn't present an opportunity for those that choose not to drink. And it's not just people from minorities or people with Muslim faith that choose not to drink. It's increasingly becoming the norm. but yet that's still a really entrenched part of the culture. What I hoped would have happened, and I tried to do as a leader of my own department in PE. So when I first arrived as a department on a Friday, we'd go for lunch, and it happened to be in a pub because that was the thing closest to school, and we'd have lunch. And a few occasions I would go because I wanted to be part of the team, and it was a really important thing for me to join this team of 11 adults. But being the only person with my faith, I felt it would have been the wrong thing to not have that chance. When I was in a position of leadership, it was a case of going, right, well, let's still have our, Christmas meal or end of term meal, but could the evening start in this alternative venue first? So we meet here, we can spend time together, have food, and then you go on and do the rest of what you need to do. So I can check out at a stage where it means I'm part of the team, but I'm not punished for the parts of the team social that I don't want to do, and I don't judge them for their lifestyle, and then they don't judge me for my lifestyle. And I don't think sport has made way for again, otherness to appear. It's got this one behavior, and interestingly, it's more in the men's side of the game. If you go to a women's football game, or you go and watch the Lionesses, where you don't have fan zones, everybody from the different teams mixes. It's very family orientated. I'm really looking forward to the Women's Euros next summer, and two of the venues are very close to where I live, but the atmosphere is completely different. And I don't know if that's because, as women's footballers who themselves have experienced so much prejudice and discrimination, to just get to this stage of having a global games, perhaps they are more aware of the responsibility to connect and to represent so many different types of people. And this is not me saying that men's football is awful. It's not. I'm a huge football fan. I watch it and talk about it all the time. But we're talking about a culture that is as old as football itself. Football came from the mob. It was a drunken man's game. It was a local working class game that was then gentrified. So to try and change that would some might argue change the very nature of the game. But what I think the game can do is think very carefully about how its players spend time together, how its players act as a team, not just when they're competing. Something that Liverpool Football Club did when they won the Premier League, because they have 3 players who are Muslim, rather than the champagne that normally players throw all over themselves. It was essentially a fizzy apple drink in the champagne flutes, so that those 3 players could be part of that experience. And all of the team were fine with it, because I'm sure they all had a drink afterwards, and they felt part of that shared identity. They were not segregated and separated from celebrating. Those 3 players were really pivotal to how the team did. And that, I think, it's a coming together of the different types of people that are accessing the sport. And I don't think you can get rid of alcohol, but I do feel that alcohol provides a veil of irresponsibility, and also for some an excuse. So therefore then they're not really reflecting upon their own actions. And it can be incredibly difficult for somebody from a minority to try and negotiate that.
Well, it takes away their filter, doesn't it? If you drink a bit too much, we all have this filter, and it kind of goes with alcohol. Gosh, I could speak to you for a lot longer, but and about lots of things. I think we're going to have to come to an end. But before we do, you probably heard about what Adele said, an audience with Adele about a teacher. Is there anybody that you had, apart from your awesome dad, who inspired you and gave you that confidence that you needed when you were younger?
Well, not to be a cliche, it is actually my PE teacher. Helen Lever, she's not a Muslim, but she's all about empowerment of women. And it was she that was at the netball trial that spoke on my behalf about my context, about the clothes that I was wearing. She saw how I just wanted to be seen as an equal. And as a teacher herself, excellent subject knowledge, genuine commitment to try and empower women to find their sport. She's a netballer, and focuses now on working with players that have learning disabilities. That's what she's made her retirement project. And I just think that as an individual, to recognize her role as a facilitator and to be prepared when necessary, and she did it on more than one occasion, to advocate for my minority status in order to allow the doors to be open for me. I've tried to reflect that in the way that I've tried to teach throughout my career. So absolutely, it's Helen Lever.
Wow, Helen sounds amazing. No, I think everybody needs somebody like that in their life, don't they? And not everybody gets it, but some do. So they're the lucky ones. Where can people find you on social media if they want to look you up?
I'm on Twitter, so at Dana Abdul. I'm also on Facebook, but Twitter is probably the best place to find me.
Thanks so much for giving up your time and coming on the podcast. It's been really fascinating, and I've learned a lot. And I have to say, you are really inspiring. I am not into sports at all, so it's been really educational for me.
Thank you, Sharmeen. It's been wonderful to be on.
That was the lovely Dana from Yorkshire. There were so many things I wanted to ask her about, like her multicultural upbringing, growing up in Yorkshire, the charity she's an ambassador for called Chance to Shine, but we sadly ran out of time, and I didn't want to interrupt her as I wanted to give her the chance to talk about her lived experience as a Muslim woman in professional sport, which I think is kind of rare. I think it was important to not edit her, even if this episode is a little bit longer than usual. So thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review, subscribe and follow the She Speaks We Hear podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Clubhouse and Facebook. I'm Sharmeen Ziauddin. See you next time.